No one has ever robbed Gringotts and kept what they took. The goblins will tell you so with some pride and a little disappointment, for they do enjoy watching people try. One night, 4 thieves came very close indeed, and the bank let them. By 10:30 on a wet Tuesday morning, Brammock had already logged 3 forged seals, 1 bewitched key, and a pair of boots that squeaked only when their owner lied. 6 levels beneath the marble hall of Gringotts, he sat at a brass counting desk, sharpening a black quill with a blade no human had ever been permitted to touch. Across from him, Varkett of Internal Security worked through the morning reports, clicking his tongue at each offense, as though personally wounded by the decline in criminal standards. He tapped a parchment. 4 of them, West Service stare. 11 tonight. The quill went into the red ink. 12 passed, Brammock corrected. The tall one will insist on waiting for the patrol bell. The parchment gave the thieves' names, or at least the ones they had chosen for the week. Cassian Vell called himself an antiquities consultant and wore dragon hide gloves, too new to have met a dragon. Marta Pike had once escaped from a ministry holding cell by turning herself into a hat stand, a feat rather spoiled when an Auror hung his coat on her. Pell Dockett specialized in locks and spoke about tumblers as though he had personally invented doors. The 4th, Osric Vale, described himself simply as a strategist, which usually meant the others carried his bags. They bribed Knackle, said Varkett. Knackle reported the bribe before breakfast. Of course he did. Brammock drew a neat line beneath the entry and wrote, offered 7 galleons. Poorly counted. He had kept the incident ledger for 43 years, though the official duty rotated every 6 months. Other guardians had tried to take it from him and returned it once they discovered that his indexing system tracked motive, footwear, wand wood, quality of disguise, and whether the offender had used the phrase foolproof plan. 218 such uses at present count. He expected to reach 219 before midnight. Varkett leaned over the desk to inspect the note. You've not written my name in the wager column. You have not placed a wager. I say Pike notices first. Brammock considered this, then slid a small silver scale between them. A sickle. Half. A sickle, or keep your opinions free of charge. Varkett set the coin on the left-hand tray. Brammock placed one on the right. His choice was Dockett, the lock specialist, on the reasoning that men who trusted doors tended to become distressed when doors developed opinions of their own. Beneath the wager, he wrote the terms. First thief to suspect, bank complicity. Suspicion must be voiced clearly. General unease does not qualify. Varkett read the conditions twice and complained only once, which Brammock regarded as acceptance. Above them, the public hall went about its ordinary business. Gold moved beneath white marble, contracts sealed themselves, and human customers whispered as though wealth might overhear them. No alarm had been raised because there was no cause to raise one. The thieves had stolen a map prepared by the goblins, bribed a cart operator employed by the goblins, and purchased a key made in a goblin workshop 3 days earlier. Their plan had cost them 86 galleons and 1 antique sneakoscope. Before the crime had so much as begun, Gringotts had earned 12 galleons in fees. At 11:20 that night, Cassian Vell entered the West Service passage disguised as a ministry examiner. The disguise would have passed muster in a ministry corridor where uniforms often stood in for competence, but Gringotts favored stone lintels with longer memories. The lintel above him noted his height, weight, true name, false name, body temperature, wand composition, and unpaid balance at a robe shop in Bath. A brass line carried the information down to the counting desk, where a narrow strip of parchment curled from a slot. Brammock read it, added a time mark, and rang a tiny bell. 12 minutes early, Varkett said. The tall one lost the argument. Through a round viewing lens set in the wall, the service passage showed in pale green light. Vel stood beneath the lintel, while Pike adjusted a badge on his chest. Dockett knelt beside a maintenance door, and Vale watched both directions with the broad patience of a man contributing nothing. Black clothes, naturally. Humans planning crimes, so often dressed as though darkness itself required a uniform. Pike wore 6 silver rings, each enchanted for a different emergency, and one of them was already busy reporting her location to the nearest magistrate. With a small flourish, Dockett produced the stolen key. "Goblin cut," he whispered. "Exact copy." Brammock glanced at Varkett and observed that it was not a copy at all. It was the original. Varkett agreed that this was so, and the lock specialist slid the key into the maintenance door and turned it 3 times to the left, exactly as described in the instructions that had been planted in his rooms. Inside the mechanism, 12 gold teeth folded away. 2 wards recorded his fingerprints, and a tiny hammer stamped his name onto a copper plate. The door swung open without the slightest resistance, and Dockett smiled over his shoulder with such satisfaction that Brammock added a small mark beside his name in the ledger, a private symbol he reserved for premature triumph. Beyond the door, a narrow stair descended into the cart tunnels. Every 7th step had been dusted with powdered moonstone, which clung invisibly to stolen goods and glowed beneath goblin lamps. Vel paused on the landing to study the empty tunnel below. "Too easy," he said. His gloved fingers tightened once around his wand, and Pike stopped smiling. For 3 seconds, all 4 of them listened. Then Vale gave a soft laugh. "That is because the plan is good." The others accepted this at once, in the way criminals so often accept a compliment offered to the group. Dockett went first, counting steps under his breath, Pike behind him with her wand raised, Vel checking the map. Vale brought up the rear, taking credit for the order in which they walked. Under the lens, the powdered moonstone brightened faintly around their soles. Varkett reached for the wager column, but Brammock covered it with one clawed hand. "General unease," he said. The conditions were clear. At the foot of the stair, a cart waited on the rails. Its brass plate read, "Out of service," and a length of chain hung loose beside the front wheel. Pike crouched to inspect the axle while Dockett examined the control lever. "Chain's been cut," she murmured. "Recently." "By Knackle," Brammock said from the counting room, "with the bank's chain cutter, entered under maintenance, Form 38. 38B, said Varkett. "It was after closing." The thieves climbed aboard. Vel in front, Vale in the safest seat, Pike with one hand on the rail, and Dockett seizing the control lever with the reverence of a musician approaching an instrument. He pushed it forward. The cart rolled smoothly into the dark, past 3 junctions, beneath a waterfall that had been switched off for cleaning, and towards a section of Gringotts no customer had entered in 71 years. Brammock closed the viewing lens and drew the ledger nearer. In the margin beside 11:34 p.m., he wrote, "Intruders have entered the guided route. Confidence high. Awareness negligible." He sanded the ink, blew the excess into a silver tray, and listened to the distant cartwheels beginning their carefully measured descent. On the scale between the two goblins, the pair of sickles remained perfectly balanced. The cart passed Junction 9 at exactly the speed Brammock had requested in his memorandum, though the memorandum itself described the matter as brake recalibration. Its wheels sang against the rails on a rising metallic note, then settled as the tunnel curved beneath the old weighing chambers. In the lens, the thieves looked pale green and very pleased with themselves. Docket leaned into each turn as though steering by force of character, while Vale pointed ahead at junction signs he had not designed and could not read. "Left at the split," he said. The cart took the right-hand branch. No one objected because the right-hand branch bent sharply enough to resemble a left. Gringotts had built several such passages during the reign of George II, after a gang from Wiltshire attempted to navigate by compass and discovered that goblin tunnels regarded magnetic north as a negotiable concept. Brammock watched Vell consult the stolen map, frown once, then turn it upside down. "There," Vell said, "exactly as marked." Pike glanced back at the disappearing junction, but the cart had already carried them on. Varkett took a boiled sweet from a paper packet and settled it carefully between his teeth. "They have missed the first vault corridor." "They were meant to. The map shows it ahead. The map also shows a lavatory beside the dragon pens." "There is no lavatory beside the dragon pens." "There was once. It lasted 3 days." Beneath the time, Brammock made a note. "Map inversion accepted without dispute. Blue ink for navigational errors, red for attempted theft, green for boasts, later contradicted by the architecture. The system had drawn complaints during an audit, chiefly because the auditor could not fathom why green needed 6 separate columns, so Brammock had produced the records from a single unsuccessful raid in 1974. The auditor had gone away and approved 8 columns. Farther down, the tunnel narrowed and the cart slowed without Docket touching the lever. Small bronze plaques began to appear along the wall, each bearing a number in goblin script and beneath it a warning in English. The English was accurate and no help at all. "Unauthorized persons must not proceed beyond the point at which they have already proceeded," read the first. Pike twisted round to inspect it and pronounced it threatening nonsense. "Legal notice," Brammock corrected. "Perfectly clear," Varkett added. The second plaque declared that all persons entering the lower galleries consented to inspection, measurement, temporary duplication, permanent marking, and retrieval of any object judged improperly acquired. Vale read it aloud, skipping the middle clauses and pronouncing retrieval as recovery, and decided it was a standard waiver. Docket laughed and pushed the lever farther forward. Beneath the floor, a brass stylus recorded the pressure of his hand and folded it into the evening's consent register. Brammock turned a page in the ledger and drew a neat tick. At the third plaque, Vell raised one gloved hand. "Stop." The cart stopped so promptly that all 4 lurched half an inch forward. Nothing squealed, nothing jarred. It simply ceased to move. obedient as a clerk who had heard his name called across the hall. Vel looked at the control lever, then at the dark rails ahead, and asked whether Docket had done that. Docket's chin rose. Naturally. Pike looked at his hand, which was no longer touching anything at all. Naturally. For a moment, none of them moved. Somewhere beyond the stone, water tapped slow and regular, and a copper pipe along the wall gave a single polite knock. Then Pike lifted her wand and sent a pale thread of light down the tunnel. It traveled 20 feet, flattened against something unseen, and came coiling back around the tip of her wand. "That," she said, "is unusual." Vale leaned past her and tapped the returning light with one finger. It vanished with a soft snap, leaving a tiny silver mark on his glove, which he judged an old security charm, probably half dead. Brammock entered the statement in the green column. The barrier withdrew the instant Vel lowered his hand, though not one of the thieves marked the connection. Docket nudged the lever, and the cart resumed its descent at the same measured pace. Behind them, without a sound, a bronze grill slid across the tunnel. No lock on their side, 3 on the other, each forged to open only when no one was attempting to leave. Gringotts had found the arrangement useful in disputes involving persistence. Ahead, a chamber opened around the rails, circular and bright with suspended lamps. 6 identical archways ringed the walls, all marked "Private Access" in English, and something more exact in goblin script. The cart rolled to the center and settled onto a brass turntable. Docket studied the arches, then drew a strip of parchment from his sleeve and announced it was the 3rd from the left. "There is no left on a circle," Pike said. "There is if one has discipline." The turntable began to rotate. It moved slowly enough for the thieves to count each arch, and quickly enough for them to lose count by the second revolution. Vale called out numbers. Docket contradicted him. Vel tried to keep one finger fixed on the chosen doorway while his whole body turned beneath it. Pike said nothing. Eyes narrowed, silver rings clicking against her wand. She watched the archways pass. "Pike is close," Varkett murmured. "She is observant. That is not yet the same thing." On the 4th revolution, the lamps dimmed in sequence, and each archway appeared to drift backwards while the chamber itself held still. A modest piece of perspective work by a goblin mason who disliked visitors. Vale swore softly and grabbed the rail. Docket announced that the rotation was an anti-apparition measure, and Vel agreed at once, though no one had mentioned apparition. Pike, meanwhile, was looking down at the floor, where the brass beneath her boots now bore 4 fresh outlines shaped exactly like their souls. The turntable stopped with one archway directly before them. It was not the 3rd from anywhere, but its door stood open and warm yellow light spilled across the rails. Beyond lay a broad corridor lined with iron boxes, each stamped with old family seals. Docket consulted his parchment, smiled, and pronounced it perfect. Brammock sharpened his quill again. The cart rolled through the open arch, and the door swung shut behind it with the quiet finality of a drawer sliding home in a well-made cabinet. Inside the counting room, one of the 2 sickles tipped a fraction on the scale, then settled back into balance as the mechanism beneath it corrected for dust. Varkett eyed the coin, suspicious of any machinery that respected precision more than suspense. Brammock wrote the next line in green ink. "Intruders have selected the only available route and credited themselves for the choice. The corridor beyond the turntable had been built for the storage of disputed inheritances, confiscated cursed objects, and property whose owners had tried to dodge the fees by dying at an inconvenient moment. Its iron boxes stood empty now, though their seals still muttered when strangers passed. Bramok opened a second viewing lens and worked the focus until the four thieves sharpened into green-edged figures. Vel walked first, the stolen map held chest high. Docket tested every third lock with professional fingers. Vale kept glancing behind at the door that had ceased to exist. Pike trailed one hand along the wall, counting the joins between stones. 42, she said. Docket looked back. What? Nothing. Bramok recorded the number beneath her name. There were 41 visible joins in that section, plus one concealed seam that led to the clerk's passage. Pike had found it by touch without understanding what she had found, which earned her a small mark of respect and no alteration whatever to the arrangements. Gringotts did not punish competence. It merely ensured that competence remained properly contained. At the far end of the corridor stood a gate of black iron worked into a pattern of clasped hands. No hinges, no keyhole, no visible gap between the bars. Above it, a bronze plate read, "Entry requires proof of lawful purpose." Docket smiled the smile Bramok had seen on men approaching both locked doors and disastrous marriages, and whispered that this one was his. From his coat, the lock specialist produced a narrow instrument, something like a tuning fork with a pearl set between its prongs. He struck it against the gate and held it steady as the pearl began to hum, the sound moving through the iron in soft ripples, hunting for wards to confuse and mechanisms to imitate. Behind the gate, goblin-made runes listened with flawless attention. Then they opened. Docket's mouth parted. There. Vale clapped him once on the shoulder. Never doubted you. The gate requires proof of unlawful purpose, Varkett said. The English plate omits the prefix, Bramok replied. Printing error? Translation economy. The gate folded inward, each clasped iron hand releasing the next. As the thieves crossed, the metal brushed their sleeves and quietly sampled loose fibers, wand residue, perspiration, and trace amounts of flue powder. Pike stopped when one iron finger caught lightly at her cuff. She tugged free and found a thin black line circling her wrist. For the first time that evening, no one spoke at once. The mark was finer than ink, and it moved when she moved, adjusting itself to stay perfectly level. Pike rubbed at it with her thumb, then tried the edge of a silver ring. The line split around the ring and rejoined on the other side. Vel bent closer and asked whether it was a tracking charm. Inventory mark, Bramok said. Vale gave the wrist an impatient glance. Residue from the gate, he told her. Wash it off later. Of course, Pike replied and lowered her sleeve before walking on. Bramok shifted one sickle on the wager scale until its edge lined up with the engraved center mark. She nearly voiced it. Nearly does not spend, Varkett said. You have learned. I have watched you refuse payment for 30 years. Beyond the gate, the walls changed, from cut stone to polished black rock veined with dull gold. Lamps kindled ahead of the thieves one by one, and those behind them went dark, in the same orderly sequence, so that the whole thing suggested courtesy. It also stopped anyone from judging distance by looking back. a feature requested after a Belgian trespasser spent 2 days walking in circles and submitted a complaint about inadequate signage. The corridor ended at a fork. One passage bore a silver arrow marked vaults. The other had no sign at all. Vel studied the map, turned it sideways, and pointed towards the blank route. The arrow is a decoy. Too obvious, Dockett agreed, nodding as though the point pained him. Precisely. Brammock added another green entry. Down the unmarked passage, the floor sloped away through air that smelled faintly of metal and sealing wax. Every 20 paces, a circular brass plate sat in the stone, each engraved with a number. Vale stepped across them without looking. Pike avoided the first two out of habit, then gave it up once Dockett assured her they were weight sensors and therefore harmless. They are weight sensors, Varkett observed. They are not harmless, Brammock said. Each plate measured the thieves, subtracted the value of their clothing, added the estimated weight of any concealed container, and calculated how much stolen gold each could carry before pride overcame caution. The figures traveled by narrow pipes to Brammock's desk, where 4 brass needles shifted across a calibrated dial. Vale ranked highest. Dockett ranked lowest, despite the 7 expanding pockets in his coat and the 1 bag charmed to weigh less on the inside than out. At the bottom of the slope, a small chamber waited, furnished with a stone bench, a jug of water, and a notice asking authorized visitors to declare all enchanted storage before proceeding. Vel tore the notice down and held it over a lamp until the parchment curled, blackened, and went to sparks. From a slot beside Brammock's elbow, a duplicate slid soundlessly into place. Destruction of notice, he said, and wrote the charge. Add replacement cost. Already included. Vale considered this. And administrative handling? Brammock looked offended. Naturally. They rested for under a minute, too keyed up to sit properly. Dockett went over his tools, Pike studied the mark beneath her cuff, and Vale rehearsed the route back in a whisper that omitted 3 turns and invented a staircase. Vel spread the map across the bench and tapped a red circle near its lower edge. 1 corridor, he said, 1 door, then the Orpington Reserve. They hadn't chosen the name, it had been chosen for them. No Orpington family had ever held a Gringotts vault, but humans trusted names that sounded old, wealthy, and faintly disappointed. The reserve existed only in forged correspondence, in overheard rumors, and on a single ledger page, stolen from a desk, left unlocked for exactly 6 minutes. Its supposed contents ran to 17th century galleons, ministry bearer bonds, and ransom gold from a goblin rebellion that had never occurred. Vale folded the map with reverence. We are about to become extremely rich. Brammock closed the lens halfway and glanced at the wager scale. They have reached the first declaration. Varkett posted another boiled sweet into his mouth. Does extremely rich count as boasting? It counts as optimism. When does optimism become evidence? When entered into an account. Somewhere in the wall, a bell chimed once. The thieves had risen and gone on into the final access corridor, where a single round door waited beneath 3 bronze lamps. Across its face, in goblin script, ran the true designation of the chamber beyond, Temporary Custody Vault, for the recovery of improperly removed coin. The English plate beneath it read, Orpington Reserve. Docket came forward with his tools ready. Pike kept her marked wrist tucked against her side. Vel's new dragon hide gloves creaked as he flexed his fingers, and Vale smiled at the door as though it had already surrendered. At his desk, Brammock turned to a fresh page and wrote the date with particular care. 7 medals had gone into the Orpington door, 3 of them without any ministry-approved English name. The circular face showed no handle, only a ring of shallow depressions set around a central plate. Docket crouched and unpacked his tools across the floor with the solemn care of a surgeon preparing to operate on someone else. Picks, probes, tuning rods, powdered quartz, and a small bottle labeled "Absolutely Safe," laid out in 2 neat rows. Brammock leaned in towards the lens. "He has arranged them by price," he said. "Perhaps by function," Barkett suggested. "No." The first probe entered a depression at the top of the door and promptly bent itself into a hook. Frowning, Docket straightened it with his wand and tried the next. That one came out coated in blue frost, though the corridor stayed pleasantly warm. Pike watched over his shoulder, rubbing the black line around her wrist beneath the cuff, while Vale offered advice in a whisper that grew more authoritative the less useful it became. Apart from them all, Vale stood with his head tilted, listening to the door. 4-layer ward, Docket said. Goblin resonance, mechanical seal, blood confirmation, and a rotational cipher. It had none of those things. The door had been instructed to resemble whatever mechanism the intruder expected to defeat, provided the expectation was complicated enough. Docket's tuning fork detected 4 layers because he had announced 4, and the central plate began to turn because he had predicted rotation. Brammock entered the observation in green ink, and beside it wrote, "Subject successfully overcoming own description." The depressions filled with a dim amber light, and Pike stepped nearer. "Why is it responding before you finish?" "Because I am close." "You said the blood confirmation came last." "It does." The plate has already taken blood. A thin red bead shone on Docket's thumb, where one of the tools had nicked him. He looked at it, then at the door, and the smile slipped at one corner of his mouth. For 3 breaths, not even Vale had anything to say. The amber lights ran round the ring and stopped directly beneath Pike's marked wrist. Vale broke the quiet with a low chuckle. "It is reading the group. You wanted a sophisticated lock, Pell. Try not to complain when you find one." Docket recovered at once. "Exactly." "That was close," Brammock said, turning to the wager scale. "No clear suspicion," Varkett replied. He questioned sequence. He questioned Docket. An important distinction in criminal law. Then the door gave a low, harmonious note. Each depression released a narrow brass pin, and the pins arranged themselves into the shape of an open hand. Docket stared at the pattern a moment, then set his palm against it, as though accepting an invitation. The mechanism measured his pulse, copied the lines of his skin, and registered him as primary remover of property. A second black mark appeared around his wrist, finer than Pike's, and edged with tiny goblin numerals. "There," he whispered as the door began to turn. "I told you." "Superb," said Vale. Behind the moving door lay a vault, bright enough to paint gold across their faces. Tier upon tier of cedar boxes filled the walls, each fitted with brass corners and a seal stamped in red wax. Loose coins lay in orderly heaps on stone tables, and tall stacks of galleons rose behind iron rails towards a ceiling lost in shadow. Nothing stirred. Nothing hissed, snapped, lunged, smoked, or performed any of the theatrical discourtesies human thieves had come to expect from protected treasure. Pike stayed on the threshold, her fingers resting against the black line beneath her sleeve, her gaze traveling over the nearest boxes without settling. "No guards," she said. "Deep vault," Vel answered. "No visible wards." "Good wards are not visible." "No dust either." Vel stepped past her and spread his arms towards the gold. "Marta, we have spent 8 months making sure this would look easy." She looked the floor over once more and followed him in. Brammock slid a second sheet beneath the ledger page to keep the fresh ink from bleeding through. "Entry complete," he said, marking active on 2. "What about the others?" "Contact required." Varkett picked another suite from the packet, found it stuck to its neighbor, and prized them apart with the tip of one claw. "Vale will touch first." "Vel." Vale has already opened an expanding sack. "He will order someone else to test the coin." Inside the vault, Vale did exactly that, holding out the sack and nodding at the nearest table. "Pell, verify the minting." Docket lifted one galleon by its edge and turned it beneath the lamps. The coin flashed, stamped his fingertips with 3 black dots, and produced a perfect duplicate on the stone. Both men went still. A second duplicate appeared beside the first, then a third, each arriving with a soft metallic click. Vale's eyebrows rose. "Gemino." "Crude," Docket said, though his voice had sharpened. "They have put a duplication curse on the surface stock." Vel came over and picked up the original coin, and 2 more galleons appeared where it had rested. Black numerals curled around his gloved thumb, sank through the new dragon hide, and went on beneath it. He watched the markings disappear into the leather, flexed his hand once, and dropped the coin into Vale's sack. The sack gave a satisfied little rustle. Vale laughed wide and delighted. "They have cursed the gold to multiply when stolen." "Touched," Pike corrected. "Even better." Brammock reached for the wager scale and gave Varkett's sickle a half turn until the queen's profile faced the ceiling. "You owe me nothing yet," he said, "but your confidence is becoming untidy." 1 coin became 4, 4 became 16, and the thieves began filling their bags. Inside 6 minutes, they had reduced 1 orderly table of gold to a waist-high drift that spread halfway across the vault. Each galleon they touched produced copies, according to a sequence set by pressure, intent, and whether the hand that held it had ever signed a lawful claim. None of the 4 had. Coins clicked into being beneath their fingers, slid off the table, and rolled away in bright, disciplined streams. And every time the sound swelled, Vale laughed. "Stop scooping from the top," Docket said. "Take from underneath. It slows the duplication." It did nothing of the sort, though the vault was courteous enough to pause for half a second each time he tried, which convinced him utterly. On his desk, Brammock watched the brass needles climb as the bags filled. This vault reckoned weight by its own arithmetic, weighing metal and ownership and criminal intent in equal measure. Vale's sack now registered 312 pounds, while appearing to weigh no more than a well-fed cat, and Docket's 7 expanding pockets had begun to argue quietly amongst themselves over the internal space. Pike alone had lifted fewer than 50 coins. "She is restraining herself," Varkit said. "She is counting." Same result. Entirely different paperwork. Over on the far side, Pike set 6 galleons in a straight line and touched each with the tip of her wand. 1 copy from the first, 2 from the second, 4 from the third. By the 6th, a neat fan of duplicates had spread around her boots. She looked down at them, then pressed her marked wrist to the nearest stack, and black script traveled off her skin and onto the gold. The letters ran too small for human eyes, so Bramok enlarged the lens. Property removed under disputed title. Bearer provisionally liable, additional penalties pending. The mark copied itself across every coin she had handled and then went traveling on through the multiplying piles. She snatched her hand back. "Cassian," she said. Vel was busy with a square case whose lid bore a ministry seal, copied upside down. "What?" "The mark is spreading. Identification curse. It is writing on the coins." "Then do not read it." "Nah." Vale found this funny enough to bend double, though he kept his sack held open all the while. "Marta, when we are living in Provence, you may hire a curse breaker to translate every letter." Pike, for her part, was looking at the round door. It stood open on an empty corridor. Nothing blocked their exit, no alarm sounded, no guards came, and the lamps held the steady brightness of a respectable office. She rubbed at the script with her thumb, watched the black line divide around her nail and rejoin. "We should leave now," she said. Varkit's claw moved towards the wager scale, and Bramok caught his wrist. "She's not accused the bank. She's recognized a problem. The wager concerns complicity. You wrote the rules to make yourself impossible to beat. I wrote them before choosing docket. That does not improve them." Inside the vault, Vel shut the square case and tested the handle. "We leave when we have enough." "We had enough 10 minutes ago," Pike replied. "There is no such amount." Docket came out from behind a cedar box with both sleeves bulging. "She is right about one thing. We should not stay longer than the schedule allows." Vale checked his watch, found the hands turning backwards, and tapped the glass. "We are ahead of schedule." The watch had been running backwards since Junction 9. Bramok had thought about correcting it, and then decided the error rather supported the general arrangement. He entered the time beside Vale's name and added a note in green. "Instrument contradicts environment. Environment dismissed." Reading over his shoulder, Varkit gave a small grunt. "That sentence applies to most human banking. Only the expensive kind." At last the thieves set about closing their containers. The coins went on multiplying inside, and the sacks expanded neatly to accommodate them. Each new galleon stamped its bearer's mark onto the lining and added itself to the provisional inventory. Vale's bag grew 4 brass buckles. It had not owned a minute before. Docket's left pocket issued a receipt. He drew out the strip of parchment and read it once. "Deposit confirmation," he said. Pike stepped closer. "Deposit?" "Collection. It means collection." "The word says deposit. In old banking language, they are interchangeable." Bramok lifted his quill from the page. "They are not." Vel took the receipt, gave it a glance, and crushed it into his glove. A fresh copy came out of Docket's pocket, then another. By the 5th, Vale snatched the lot and rammed them down among the gold, said, "Paperwork later," and and the sack fastened itself. For the first time, his smile thinned. Above the door, a soft chime sounded, and the inner lamps shifted from gold to white, marking the end of the removal phase and the beginning of the recovery phase. Dockett's head came up sharply. I was not there before. The light? The bell. Vel adjusted his grip on the square case. Timed ward. Pike, though, was looking from the open doorway to the marked coins, to the receipts still coming one by one out of Dockett's pocket. Or they know. Silence held for exactly 2 seconds. Then Vale laughed. If they knew, we would not be standing here. Bramok let go of Varket's wrist and turned the wager scale towards himself. Clear suspicion of bank knowledge, Varket said. From Pike. Yes. Your sickle? Varket smiled with all the warmth of a successful tax appeal. Bramok opened the ledger, set the result beneath the original wager, and signed it with a precise downward stroke, then added a second line. Suspicion immediately overruled by strategist. Recovery phase authorized. In the vault, the first galleon rolled out of Vale's sealed sack. It dropped from the bottom without leaving a hole, struck the floor, spun once, and rolled off towards the nearest cedar box with the purposeful speed of a clerk. Late for an appointment, a second followed, then a third, each passing through the fabric as cleanly as light through glass. Vale seized the sack in both hands and lifted it higher. The coins kept falling. Fault in the expansion charm, Dockett said. Your charm, Pike replied. It was sound when we entered. Then the gold has altered it. Gold rarely improves human magic, Bramok observed. Inside the counting room, the recovery register had begun filling itself. Thin strips of parchment feeding from a brass slot and stacking by bearer, denomination, year of minting, and degree of resistance. Vale's column was already the longest. Varket collected his winning sickle from the scale and polished it against his sleeve, taking rather more time over it than the task required, and Bramok allowed this because victory, unlike theft, was legally his. So, out across the floor, the escaping coins had formed 4 separate lines. Those marked to Pike went in single file, keeping an equal distance one from the next. Dockets came out in groups of 7, matching the number of pockets he had enchanted. Vels left the square case by passing straight through its brass corners. Veils tumbled in such numbers that they made a broad golden ribbon. Hold the bag shut, Vale snapped. They are shut, Pike said. Shut them more firmly. Dockett wrapped both arms around his coat and muttered a reinforcement charm. Every seam tightened at once, drawing the garment in around him until his elbows were pinned to his ribs. The pockets bulged, shuddered, and pushed a receipt out through his collar. Pike had it free before he could object. Property retrieval in progress, she read. Poor translation, Dockett said. It is signed. Forgery. The signature is moving. Sure enough, the goblin name at the foot of the parchment walked from left to right in tiny black strokes, then returned to where it had started. Bramok recognized the hand of a junior claims clerk called Nibre, whose penmanship was ambitious and whose spacing wanted discipline. He made a note to review the form once the thieves had been processed, since a trap could work perfectly and still expose weaknesses in the administration. Vel stepped into the path of the coins and planted a boot across the golden line. The first galleon stopped against his heel, the next struck it, then the next, until a small heap had gathered behind him. There, he said, they can be blocked. The heap climbed to his ankle. Then the first coin slipped beneath the sole, crossed through the leather, and dropped from the toe on the far side, and every coin behind it took the same route. Vel looked down at the undamaged boot and gave it one hard stamp. Pike watched the line go on towards the boxes. They are not traveling through matter. What are they doing? Vale demanded. Correcting location, she said. Bramok copied the phrasing into the ledger and set a small mark beside it. Legally, the wording was imprecise, though the principle behind it deserved a measure of respect. Goblin work had never treated possession as a matter of who had last got their hands on a thing. Ownership stayed bound to craft, to agreement, to lawful transfer, and none of those bent for a deep pocket and a hopeful face. Over at the cedar boxes, the coins were sorting themselves. Every lid rose just far enough to swallow the correct denomination before closing again with a soft wooden click. Older galleons filed into the left-hand cases and the newer ones into the right, while the sickles and knuts, thrown up by incidental multiplication, trickled down into smaller drawers below. Among these moving streams, the thieves stood and turned from one container to the next, watching their fortune leave them in flawless order. Not a single coin went to the wrong box. Vale drew his wand. Finite. The spell struck the nearest row of galleons and split into 12 smaller spells, each of which skated harmlessly over the gold and disappeared into a different box. 12 parchment slips followed a moment later, sliding out of a slot beside the door. Docket lifted one in his bound hands and read the top line aloud. Unauthorized cancellation request denied. Try again, Vale said. Additional attempts incur fees. Try again. 11 more slips emerged, and Bramok raised an eyebrow at them. Repeat application, he murmured, writing the charge down. Premium rate. By the time the last galleon had gone from Vale's sack, 4 black marks sat clustered about his wrist like ill-fitting bracelets, each one inscribed with a separate liability. He looked at them for a while, then dragged off his glove and rubbed the skin with the heel of his hand. His wrist turned. The marks stayed perfectly level. Pike, he noticed, had stopped touching hers altogether. The vault door began to turn. Coat still cinched tight. Docket shuffled to it and reached the threshold before the others. As he came near, the round slab swung wider, showing the same corridor they had entered by. Move, he said. We take what remains and go. What remained came to 3 loose knuts under a table, and 1 galleon lodged, for the moment, in the cuff of Vale's trousers. Pike stooped for none of it. Vel picked up the empty square case, whose ministry seal had quietly corrected itself, and now read false copy in small red letters. Vale aimed a kick at the nearest cedar box, and it answered with a claim form. They left in a brisk, orderly little knot. Behind them, the last galleon worked itself free of Vale's cuff, rolled across the floor, and vanished into its proper box. The lamps went back to gold, every lid shut, every drawer settled, and the round door swung shut after the thieves in no particular hurry. At his desk, Bramok totaled the recovered sum against the morning balance. The figures matched to the last knut, though the bank had also collected 18 galleons in penalties, 3 damaged tool fees, and 1 charge for excessive spell correspondence. He sanded the page and glanced at the corridor display, where the 4 of them were making for a door plainly marked Exit. Now, Varkett said, pocketing a sickle, We see whether they read. They have read throughout, said Bramok. Understanding was never included. The door marked exit opened inwards. Docket got there first and pulled. Nothing happened. He pushed instead, and it gave way so smoothly that he nearly fell into the passage beyond. Vale caught him by the shoulder, took in the engraved instruction, and gave a short nod of approval. Counterweighted, he said, clever but simple. Doors that open the wrong way are neither, said Bramok. Beyond, the passage seemed to climb toward the upper tunnels, though the floor was sloping down under their boots by a good 3 degrees. Gringotts had worked out long ago that people trusted their eyes far sooner than their ankles. Lines of pale stone drew inward toward the ceiling. The lamps brightened at even intervals, and a thread of warm air came drifting up past them from somewhere below. Vel took one breath and pointed. Surface draft. It was nothing of the kind. The draft came from a bakery warming chamber 2 levels deeper down. Bramok had objected when the vent went in, since cinnamon fouled the mineral scent used for directional testing, and the facilities department had answered that intruders moved faster when they thought food or daylight lay ahead. 40 years of records bore them out, a fact he still found irritating. At the first junction, 3 doors stood beneath bronze signs: Public Hall, Cart Station, and Claims and Disputed Property. Vale went for Public Hall without breaking stride. It opened onto a narrower corridor holding 4 more doors, every one of them labeled Public Hall, each in slightly different lettering. Pike stopped. Which one? The nearest, Vale said, and when she asked why, he added, because they expect us to overthink it. Bramok entered this in green ink and noted a reference to Incident 88, in which a witch from Surrey had made precisely the same observation before choosing a cupboard. This door did not lead to a cupboard. It led to another junction, which Bramok thought a good deal more educational. Behind them, meanwhile, the black wrist marks had started to sprout small arrows, each one pointing away from the surface and toward the nearest processing room. Pike caught sight of hers first and tilted her arm under a lamp. These are guiding us. Tracking us, Vel corrected. The arrows are ahead of us. Predictive tracking. Docket twisted his marked wrist until the arrow lay sideways and held it there. The mark rotated on its own and resumed its old direction. Whatever remark rose in him, he pressed his mouth shut on it. Bramok caught the movement through the lens and set a dot beside Docket's name in the wager column, purely for the historical record. Varkett leaned over the ledger. The wager is settled. A settled wager may still gather evidence. You dislike losing. I dislike incomplete records. At the next turn, Vale brought out the stolen map and found the ink had rearranged itself. The route they had followed now formed the outline of a goblin face and profile, and the way back had become a neat column of V's. He held the parchment nearer to a lamp, then farther off. Heat-responsive security ink. Pike read the first charge aloud. Unauthorized entry 4 counts, fraudulent credentials 4 counts, improper handling of duplicated currency 186 counts. Administrative intimidation, said Vale. The total is at the bottom. Do not read the bottom. They went on. A narrow stair climbed ahead beneath an arch marked Upper Access, and the visible ascent hurried them up it. Under their weight, each step compressed by a fraction, lowering the whole stair as they rose, so that by the time they reached the top, they stood 12 feet below where they had started. Docket looked back down the steps. "That is impossible." "No," said Pike, "that is engineered." Vel laid a hand flat against the wall and studied the seams. "Moving staircase." When Docket objected that there were no hinges, he said only, "Hidden hinges," and the wall opened beside his palm. Beyond it lay a square chamber, 4 wooden chairs, a brass counter, a row of numbered ticket dispensers, and no windows at all. Above the counter, a polished sign announced temporary waiting room for persons retaining property claims of doubtful merit. They stood reading it while the door behind them stayed open. Vale laughed once. "Waiting room, good. Public level." A machine at the wall spat out 4 tickets untouched, and Pike snatched the first before it hit the floor. The number on it was 1, so was Docket's, so were Vel's and Vale's. "That is inefficient," Docket said. "Separate categories," Vale replied. The door behind them closed. No bolts drove home, no alarm sounded. Stone simply met stone, leaving no seam where Vel's hand had found one a moment before. Docket went across and put his ear to the wall. Vale searched the brass counter for another way out. Pike only stood beneath the sign with all 4 tickets in her hand. Brammock shut the viewing lens and got up from his chair. "They have arrived?" Barkett squared the claim forms into a tidy stack. "Shall I call the recovery clerks?" "They are already waiting." "And the ministry?" "They were notified at 11:20. Brammock lifted the incident ledger, checked that the ink had dried, and tucked it under one arm. He paused at the door of the counting room to look at the empty wager scale, and there he set his losing sickle down on the correct side. Beneath Docket's name, he added a final note. Suspected, late. Spoke, never. There was no clock in the waiting room, and this became the thieves' chief complaint almost at once. Vale searched the walls for one, as though timekeeping were a constitutional right. Docket bent over the ticket dispenser. Pike inspected all 4 chairs without lowering himself into any of them. Coming to the brass counter, Vale rapped it once with a single knuckle. The sound traveled through the metal, crossed 3 offices, and rang a bell beside Brammock's shoulder. "They have requested service," he said. "Impatiently?" asked Varkett. Redundant. By the clerk's passage, the very route Pike had counted without seeing. Brammock made his way towards the waiting room. Its door opened to his palm and sealed behind him before the corridor lamps had time to dim. Varkett came after with the forms, a fresh ink pot, and the collected evidence arranged in labeled envelopes, and 2 younger guards followed last, neither with a drawn weapon. Nothing in that room called for persuasion by force. Inside, Vale had climbed onto a chair to read the sign above the counter. He announced that temporary meant there was a release procedure, and Pike replied, without looking up, that all detention was temporary. "Exactly," Vale said. Pike told him that this did not support his argument. Meanwhile, Docket had worked a silver pick into the ticket dispenser. The machine took it, stamped the tool with number 1, and drew it gently from his hand. And a moment later, the pick emerged behind Brammock through a narrow evidence slot. He caught it, turned it over to consider the workmanship, and passed it along. "Overpriced," he said. French, said Varkit. That explains the handle. The counter shutter rose by 6 inches. Vale jumped down and reached it first, arranging his face into the expression humans wore when they hoped authority had mistaken them for customers. Through the gap, he could see only Brammock's eyes, the ledger, and one corner of Varkit's form stack. He said there had been an error, and Brammock, opening the ledger, agreed there had been several. A wrong passage, Vale offered. Repeatedly, said Brammock. They were authorized ministry examiners, Vale insisted, at which Brammock observed that the badge spelled ministry with 2 N's. Vale glanced down. The forged badge had corrected nothing. Vale stepped in beside him and laid both gloved hands flat on the counter. Name your price. Were you? Brammock turned a page and read it out. Unauthorized entry, fraudulent identification, attempted removal of protected assets, interference with notices, misuse of security instruments, damage to 1 cedar box, and 11 repeated cancellation requests. I meant your personal price. So did I. Behind Vale, Pike made a quiet sound through her nose, and Vale shot her a look before turning back to the shutter. They knew, he said, how goblins thought. No, Brammock said. You know how humans describe goblins when selling one another bad plans. Varkit slid the first 4 forms beneath the gap, each bearing a thief's true name, a wand description, a marked wrist number, and a provisional liability total. Docket read his twice before checking the others. Vale's amount was highest by a considerable margin. This could not be lawful, Docket said. It was itemized, Brammock replied. That, said Docket, was not the same thing. And Brammock allowed that it was at least a promising beginning. Pike held her form up beneath the ceiling lamp and studied the black lettering. Property remains in bank custody, she read aloud. Recovery completed. No principal loss. Vale snatched the page from her hand and ran his eyes down the columns to the final figure. Then there was no theft, he said. There had been an attempt, said Brammock. Nothing had left the bank, Vale insisted. Neither did you. The shutter stayed open at precisely 6 inches. Enough for documents, insufficient for dignity. Vale tried to slide his wand beneath it. The brass counter measured the wand, wrote a receipt, and drew it gently from his fingers, and Varkit set it in a velvet-lined tray beside Docket's pick. 12 1/4 inches, he said. Walnut. Unlicensed modification at the grip, Brammock added. Vale withdrew his empty hand. A second slot opened near the floor. Out of it came Vale's sack, flattened, cleaned, and folded into a square, then Docket's coat with its pockets restored to ordinary dimensions, then Pike's rings in a sealed pouch, and Vale's case bearing the corrected red stamp. Each item had a claim number tied to it with string. Vale kicked the folded sack aside. It unfolded, returned to the slot, and came out, folded again. Please do not obstruct processed property, Brammock said. The 4 of them stood in a line before the counter, though no one had told them to. Pike kept her marked wrist visible now. Docket's gaze went back and forth between the shutter hinges and the smooth walls, calculating with less confidence than before, while Vale held his liability form out at arm's length, as though distance might reduce the total. Vale alone went on smiling, but the smile had become a piece of equipment he had forgotten to put down. From somewhere beyond the room came the soft wooden click of cedar boxes closing, the sound repeating in orderly sequence. followed by the faint roll of one late knut dropping into its drawer. Brammock held his quill above the ledger until the counting tube beside him chimed. Varkett checked the figure and nodded. "Balance confirmed," he said. Brammock wrote the sum beneath the evening's entries, down to the last knut. The outer door opened on 2 ministry officials and 3 goblin guards, all with empty hands. Vale turned towards them, then back to the shutter, apparently hunting for the point at which negotiation had ceased to be useful. Brammock lowered the brass panel by 1 inch. "Your waiting period continues elsewhere," he said. "This room is required at midnight." Pike gathered the 4 numbered tickets from the floor before stepping aside for the guards. Dockett watched his silver pick disappear into an evidence envelope. Vale's corrected case clicked shut on its own. Vale left his folded sack where it lay, and the slot opened once more, drew it in, and issued a receipt. By 12 minutes past midnight, the 4 thieves had been moved to a second windowless room, 2 floors above the recovery vault. A longer bench, a narrower table, and a ministry notice explaining the silence could be recorded as accurately as speech. Vale objected to the absence of windows, then to the wording of the notice, then asked whether objections were billable. The ministry clerk said they were not. Brammock made a private note to recommend the idea. Processing went in alphabetical order, which put Dockett first, and irritated Vale before his own turn had even begun. Each wand was weighed, tested, and set in a numbered case, while the black markings around their wrists supplied dates, times, touched objects, attempted spells, and one remarkably complete account of who had kicked the cedar box. Watching the marks copy themselves onto the clerk's parchment, Dockett protested that it was compelled testimony. "It was inventory," Brammock replied. "You could not inventory an action," Dockett said. "Humans do it poorly every day." At the far end of the table sat Pike, hands folded, the 4 identical tickets lined up before her. Number 1 had faded from each and been replaced by a different processing code. She arranged them lowest to highest, corrected one that was upside down, and slid the lot towards the clerk without being asked. Varkett noticed. She would have made a competent accounts examiner. He murmured. "She chose theft," said Brammock. "A temporary lapse?" 8 months of planning lacks the required brevity. Vale signed nothing. He read every form, challenged every clause, and requested definitions for terms whose meanings were plain from context and inconvenient in consequence. Brammock answered each question by turning to the relevant section of the ledger and reading it out exactly once. By the 9th definition, the smile had worn to a thin line. Vale said that all of this had been prepared before they entered. Some forms, Brammock told him, were prepared in 1762. "You knew we were coming," Vale said. "Knackle filed the bribe, and you allowed it. We allowed you to proceed along an authorized route for unauthorized persons." The ministry clerk paused over his quill. Vale stared at Brammock, then at Vale, as though one of them had altered the grammar of the evening while he was not looking. "Authorized route," he repeated. "You opened the doors." "They had opened according to their terms," said Brammock. "You sent the cart," said Vale. "It had been placed out of service. You marked the vault." "We labeled it." "In English," Vale said. "That was generous." No one spoke for several seconds. The room stayed neither cold nor dark, and the lamps made no effort to flicker for effect. Somewhere inside the wall, a counting mechanism finished its cycle and reset with a quiet click. Docket studied the circles of script wound round his wrist. Pike turned one numbered ticket over and back again. Vale's folded sack rested in an evidence tray, its corners aligned precisely with the edges. Varkett placed the wager sickle on the table beside Brammock's ledger. For the record, he said, Pike suspected bank knowledge first. Brammock drew a line through the wager entry and wrote, "Paid" beside it. She had suspected, he agreed, and Vale had dismissed it, repeatedly and with confidence. Vale leaned forward and asked whether they were discussing a bet. A small one, Varkett told him. On us? On sequence. Vale's head turned slowly towards Pike. You knew? I said we should leave, Pike said. She had told them the mark was spreading, and it was. She'd simply not mentioned that the entire bank was arranging their footsteps. She looked at the sealed evidence pouch that held her rings and said she'd thought that might sound excessive. It would have been accurate, Brammock said, closing the ledger halfway. The processing clerk finished the final page and blew across the ink. 4 files stacked beneath 4 wands, 4 sets of tools, 4 receipts for property that had never become theirs. Their liability total stayed on separate sheets because combining them might have suggested shared ownership. Gringotts avoided imprecision even in disappointment. Before leaving, Brammock returned to the lower counting chamber, with Varkett beside him. The passages had already resumed their ordinary arrangement, the junction signs pointing where they had pointed that morning, the turntable at rest beneath its 6 arches, the bronze warnings waiting for the next person inclined to mistake clarity for nonsense. Knackle's cart stood chained in its proper bay, under a fresh maintenance seal. Cedar boxes lined the walls of the recovery vault in perfect rows. Every galleon lay sorted by year and mint. Every sickle rested in its appointed tray, and the incidental canutes had gone back to the smallest drawers. A newly fitted corner and an invoice marked the damaged box. Brammock inspected the shelves twice because confidence was no substitute for arithmetic. Varkett read the final column aloud. Principal unchanged, penalties credited, administrative costs pending, 1 losing wager paid. Correct, Brammock said. And yes, he had entered the wager, the nightly record, because it had altered the balance of his purse. By 1 sickle, Varkett noted. Accounts did not become optional when small. Brammock placed the ledger in its brass cabinet and turned the key. Above them, 4 thieves sat beneath ministry lamps with their numbered files, arranged on a table and no window through which to admire the night. Far below, the last canute settled flat in its box, the drawer closed, and Gringotts stood exactly as rich as it had been that morning. The 4 of them went, in the end, to the ministry, which found the paperwork immaculate and the charges impossible to argue with. Gringotts asked for nothing further. It rarely does. The goblins had learned long ago that the surest way to keep a fortune is to let a clever thief believe for 1 whole night that he has already stolen it.